Right. Thank you guys for joining me this evening, and we might have others join us, and there might be some catching up online later. But we're talking about a topic that I think is really interesting, which is how Jews are depicted and understood in European folklore. Spoiler alert, it's mostly negative. There's not really a lot of positive depictions of Jews in historical European folklore. And most of what we're going to look at this evening is actually related to the Brothers Grimm, this famous set of tales which were compiled of mostly German but largely Central European folklore from the medieval and early modern period. And I wanted to start by reading you one of the stories, one that you've probably never read, and one that thankfully wasn't turned into a Disney movie, unlike many of the other Brothers Grimm tales. It's called The Jew in the Thorns. So you can sit back and we'll have a bit of story time, and then we'll think more about it. Once upon a time, there was a rich man who had a servant who served him diligently and honestly. Every morning he was the first one out of bed, and at night the last one to go to bed. Whenever there was a difficult job that nobody wanted to do, he was always the first to volunteer. He never complained at any of this, but was contented with everything and always happy. When his year was over, his master gave him no wages, thinking, "That is the smartest thing to do, for it will save me something. He won't leave me, but will gladly stay here working for me." The servant said nothing, but did his work the second year as he had done before, and when at the end of this year he again received no wages, he still stayed on without complaining. When the third year had passed, the master thought it over, then put his hand into his pocket, but pulled out nothing. However, this time the servant said, "Master, I have served you honestly for 3 years. Be so good as to give me what by rights I have coming to me. I would like to be on my way and see something else of the world." "Yes, my good servant," answered the old miser. "You have served me without complaint, and you shall be kindly rewarded." With this he put his hand into his pocket, then counted out 3 hellers, one at a time, saying, "There, you have a heller for each year. That is a large and generous reward. Only a few masters would pay you this much." The good servant, who understood little about money, put his wealth into his pocket and thought, now that I have a full purse, why should I worry and continue to plague myself with hard work?" So he set forth, uphill and down, singing and jumping for joy. Now it came to pass that as he was passing by a thicket, a little dwarf stepped out and called to him, "Where are you headed, merry brother? You don't seem to be burdened down with cares." "Why should I be sad?" answered the servant. "I have everything I need. 3 years' wages are jingling in my pocket." "How much is your treasure?" the dwarf asked him. "How much? 3 hellers in real money, precisely counted." "Listen," said the dwarf, "I am a poor and needy man. Give me your 3 hellers. I can no longer work, but you are young and can easily earn your bread." Now because the servant had a good heart and felt pity for the dwarf, he gave him his 3 hellers, saying, "In God's name, I won't miss them." Then the dwarf said, "Because I see that you have a good heart, I will grant you 3 wishes, one for each heller. They shall all be fulfilled." "Aha," said the servant, "you are a miracle worker. Well then, if it is to be so, first of all I wish for a blowpipe that will hit everything I aim at. Second, for a fiddle, that when I play it, anyone who hears it will have to dance. And third, that whenever I ask a favor of anyone, it will be granted." "You shall have all that," said the dwarf. He reached into the bush, and what do you think? There lay a fiddle and a blowpipe all ready, just as if they had been ordered. He gave them to the servant, saying, "No one will ever be able to deny any request that you make." "What more could my heart desire?" said the servant to himself, and went merrily on his way. Soon afterward he met a Jew with a long goatee, who was standing listening to a bird singing high up in the top of a tree. "One of God's own miracles," he shouted, "that such a small creature should have such a fearfully loud voice. If only it were mine, if only someone would sprinkle some salt on its tail." "If that is all you want," said the servant, "then the bird shall soon be down here." He took aim, hit it precisely, and the bird fell down into a thorn hedge. "Rogue," he said to the Jew, "go and fetch the bird out for yourself." "My goodness," said the Jew, "don't call me a rogue, sir. But I will be the dog and get the bird out for myself. After all, you're the one who shot it." Then he lay down on the ground and began crawling into the thicket. When he was in the middle of the thorns, the good servant could not resist the temptation to pick up his fiddle and began to play. The Jew's legs immediately began to move, and he jumped up. The more the servant fiddled, the better went the dance. However, the thorns ripped apart the Jew's shabby coat, combed his beard, and pricked and pinched him all over his body. "My goodness," cried the Jew. "What do I want with your fiddling? Stop playing, sir. I do not want to dance." But the servant did not listen to him, and thought, "You have fleeced people often enough, and now the thorn head shall do the same to you." He began to play all over again, so that the Jew had to jump even higher, leaving scraps from his coat hanging on the thorns. "Oh, woe is me," cried the Jew. "I will give the gentleman anything he asks, if only he quits fiddling, even a purse filled with gold." "If you are so generous," said the servant, "then I will stop my music, but I must praise the singular way that you danced to it." Then he took his purse and went on his way. The Jew stood there quietly watching the servant until he was far off and out of sight, and then he screamed out with all his might, "You miserable musician, you beer-house fiddler! Wait until I catch you alone. I will chase you until you wear the soles off your shoes. You ragamuffin, just put a groschen in your mouth so that you'll be worth 6 hellers." He continued to curse as fast as he could speak. As soon as he had thus refreshed himself a little, and caught his breath again, he ran into the town to the judge. "Judge, sir," he said, "oh, woe is me! See how a godless man has robbed me and abused me on the open road. A stone in the ground would feel sorry for me. My clothes are ripped into shreds, my body is pricked and scratched to pieces, and what little I owned has been taken away with my purse. Genuine ducats, each piece more beautiful than the others. For God's sake, let the man be thrown into prison." The judge asked, "Was it a soldier who cut you up like that with his saber?" "God forbid," said the Jew. "He didn't have a naked dagger, but rather a blowpipe hanging from his back, and a fiddle from his neck. The scoundrel can easily be recognized." The judge sent his people out after him. They found the good servant, who had been walking along quite slowly, and they found the purse with the money on him as well. When he was brought before the judge, he said, "I did not touch the Jew, nor take his money. He offered it to me freely so that I would stop fiddling, because he could not stand my music." "God forbid," cried the Jew. "He is reaching for lies like flies on the wall." The judge did not believe his story and said, "That is a poor excuse. No Jew would do that." And because he had committed robbery on the open road, the good servant was sentenced to the gallows. As he was being led away, the Jew screamed after him, "You good-for-nothing, you dog of a musician, now will you receive your well-earned reward." The servant walked quietly up the ladder with the hangman, but on the last rung he turned around and said to the judge, "Grant me just one request before I die." "Yes," said the judge, "if you do not ask for your life." "I do not ask for life," answered the servant, "but let me play my fiddle one last time." The Jew cried out miserably, "For God's sake, do not allow it, do not allow it." But the judge said, "Why should I not grant him this short pleasure? It has been promised to him, and he shall have it." In any event, he could not have refused because of the gift that had been bestowed on the servant. The Jew cried, "Oh, woe is me! Tie me up tightly." The good servant took his fiddle from his neck and made ready. As he played the first stroke, they all began to quiver and shake, the judge and the clerks and the court officials. The rope fell out of the hand of the one who was going to tie up the Jew. At the second stroke, they all lifted their legs. The hangman released the good servant and made ready to dance. At the third stroke, everyone jumped up and began to dance. The judge and the Jew were out in front and were the best at jumping. Soon everyone who had gathered in the marketplace out of curiosity was dancing with them, old and young, fat and thin, all together with each other. Even the dogs that had run along with the crowd stood up on their hind legs and hopped along as well. The longer he played, the higher the dancers jumped, until they were knocking their heads together and crying out terribly. Finally, the judge, quite out of breath, shouted, "I will give you your life, but just stop fiddling." The good servant listened to this, then took his fiddle, hung it around his neck again, and climbed down the ladder. He went up to the Jew, who was lying upon the ground gasping for air, and said, "You rogue, now confess where you got the money, or I will take my fiddle off my neck and begin to play again." I stole it, he cried, "but you have honestly earned it." With that, the judge had the Jew led to the gallows and hanged as a thief. All right, what do we make of this story? The Jew and the Thorns, the Brothers Grimm, number 110, from their 1857 compilation.
It was a good job it wasn't sent out in the storybooks.
Much of the original Brothers Grimm stories were not, and were successively edited out of the collections, this one included. But this was very prominent in the collections published in Germany, and very prominently recycled in many of the collections which showed up in the 20th century in Germany of the Grimm fairy tales. Who is the Jew in this story?
He's a thief, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a thief, it seems, and a deceiver. He's deeply unsympathetic, even though he's the victim of a crime. He's the one who is compelled to dance in the thorns and hurt by them. He goes to the judge for justice, and it seems like justice might be found. But then the servant, who of course we hear many, many times is moral and good and upright, finds a way to outsmart the Jew and has him hung instead of himself.
It's Haman, as opposed to Mordecai, and well, so it's the Purim story.
It feels a bit like that, doesn't it? Someone built a gallows for someone else and then it got switched. And the other person got hung. In this case, it goes the other direction, of course. This is quite typical of many stories, many folk tales, much of European folklore, and how it depicts Jews. Obsessed with money, largely unsympathetic, worried predominantly about their own honor, rude and ungrateful for the treatment they receive from people around them. And it lays out a very strong foundation in some ways of what we would see in many different aspects of contemporary folklore. Have a few things to show you and a few more things to discuss as well. But I think it's a good thing to think about as we open up and look at this topic. Let's see. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So this is a illustration of that story in one of the Brother Grimms. I had to put on 2 slides, just so you can see the visual side of this. So the top half here shows many of the little vignettes from the story as we read about them. There's the good servant, who of course is depicted as a lovely, upstanding European man. The miserly old man who he worked for as a servant for a long time. And then we see the image of the dwarf, who gives him the blessing with the fiddle because he gave him charity because he's so good. And the Jew, depicted in a long cloak with a skull cap and a long goatee, in the thorns being tortured, coming to the judge to try and make his case, and then being led away to the gallows at the end. The second half, the bottom of the page, depicts the final scene of the story, in which everyone is dancing because of the fiddler's ability and the magical gifts he was given. Everyone is lifted up into the air, and all things are turned right again from the point of view of the story. Because of the fiddler's gifts, because of his many moral virtues, he's able to outsmart the tricksy Jew and have him hung instead. The images, obviously, of how Jews are depicted is a whole topic unto itself. The clothing, the dress, the way in which religious aspects of dress and style were depicted. And it's something which is remarkably deep in European culture. Not just in Germany and Austria, where these stories were collected from, but all across Europe. Jews were depicted as the enemy, and often in very, what we now understand to be anti-Semitic tropes. Obsessed with money, always keen to outsmart people, using intelligence as a weapon against upstanding, moral Christians. There's perhaps no greater example than a famous story that we do read to our children at bedtime. Anyone want to guess what that one is? He's not named as a Jew, but if we look at the story of Rumpelstiltskin, one of the stories of the Brothers Grimm, we have a very similar depiction of the villain, Rumpelstiltskin, in that story, as someone who tricks and deceives, as someone who lends money and then uses false negotiations to try and win the money back, as someone who never tells the truth and never tells their true name, who hides in plain sight. So much of the story of Rumpelstiltskin is what we would now call Jew-coded. So he's never called a Jew. He's some kind of otherworldly demonic creature. But in every way, the stories depict him as someone Jewish and describe him with Jewish tropes and stereotypes. And much of the art surrounding the story of Rumpelstiltskin is actually also using the same kind of imagery that you see here and elsewhere in depicting him as having Jewish features. So even in places where it's not so labeled, this one is obvious. It's obviously anti-Semitic, and it's obviously about Jews because it's called The Jew in the Thorns. Rumpelstiltskin isn't called that, but there's a lot of ways in which that story too reflects a lot of the same stereotypes about Jews in Christian imagination. And it's not just in the past that this is the case, it's up until the present day as well. One of the controversies, which perhaps you guys are aware of, and certainly I've heard way more than I care to about, is the question of the goblins in Harry Potter. Have you read Harry Potter?
Yes.
Yes. So this is the entry from the Harry Potter wiki describing the goblins. Goblins are a highly intelligent race of small, magical humanoid beings with long fingers and feet that coexist with the wizarding world. Their diet consists of meat, roots, and fungi. Goblins converse in a language known as gobbledygook and are adept metalsmiths notable for their silverwork. They even mint coins for wizarding currency. Due to their skills with money and finances, they control the wizarding economy to a large extent and run Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Sounds a bit familiar. And there's been quite a big debate about whether or not the goblins in Harry Potter are anti-Semitic or not. And I think it's a really useful way for us to think about how Jews are depicted in European culture, because a lot of it depends on factors which are not obvious. What do you think? For those, you've read it, yeah? Do you think the goblins are anti-Semitic in Harry Potter?
I looked at it quite naively and just enjoyed the story as it was. The point is, you can read things into everything, can't you?
You absolutely can. There's, you can see things ways that aren't intended, which may be the case here. Sarah, Nick, what do you think? You're on mute.
I can't imagine that J.K. Rowling would intend it to be anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I don't believe she did. I'm pretty convinced she hasn't. She's been quite a vocal supporter of Jewish community in many ways. There's no indication that J.K. Rowling is an anti-Semitic person, as far as I'm concerned. And I don't know that it is true to say that the depiction of the goblins is anti-Semitic in Harry Potter, because her intent should matter a great deal. But what's really interesting is that it's kind of unavoidable to see a certain similarity, even if we recognize that we are maybe reading a lot into it. I mean, this guy here, leaning over the bank counter with his long fingers and his glasses and his crooked teeth, counting money and obsessing over the hoard of silver and gold in the bank, is certainly a character who looks a lot like many of the depictions of Jews in European folklore. Unfortunately, the directors of the film made a unfortunate choice, I imagine. If you look at the way in which Gringotts Bank is actually filmed, the floor has a bunch of tiles that make a pattern of a Magen David in it, which I'm sure is an accident, but is deeply unfortunate considering all the other factors at play here. It's a really interesting question, one that people have been debating about a lot the last couple of years. Some famous Jewish celebrities, Jon Stewart among them and others, made a point of saying that they thought the goblins were anti-Semitic. J.K. Rowling has commented on it a few times and defended herself as simply drawing on European folklore. She's explained, well, all of the stuff in Harry Potter is drawn on European tropes and folklore, things from Celtic and German and French and other mythology. Witches, wizards, all of the creatures, the griffins and hippogriffs, all of the things in the books are actually things that she did not invent, but rather has taken from other stories and used in her own. So the question is, how deep do these things run? And when someone's just drawing on a long tradition of folklore, if that folklore has certain explicit anti-Semitic aspects, do things that draw on it share those? What do you think?
I don't think she should be penalised for it because she's probably not aware, because she wasn't looking for that at the time. But then somebody else can say, as you say, can turn everything round and say that's anti-Semitic. Because in this day and age, you can't say anything. Whatever you say is wrong.
It's absolutely true. It's very hard to say something that doesn't offend someone. And I think it matters a lot what the intent is and what the author themselves says about it. Another example that is relevant to this in many ways is the world of J.R.R. Tolkien. Have you guys read Lord of the Rings, seen the films? Mm. So Tolkien explicitly said later in his life that the dwarves were based in many ways upon his understanding of Jews. Now, he had quite a positive view of Jews, so he thought that was a compliment. And perhaps it is. The dwarves, of course, in the stories, particularly of The Hobbit, are a people who have been cast out of their homeland, who are noble and honorable, if difficult and intransigent, who are leading themselves back to their homeland to reclaim it from Smaug, the evil dragon, and thus to reestablish themselves in their ancestral homeland. Tolkien obviously drew a lot in terms of Zionism and Jewish people's hope to return to the land of Israel, and he uses Hebrew as an inspiration for the dwarvish language, right? He uses a lot of his own skills in language and his history of understanding ancient Hebrew when he writes the dwarvish language. But all of those positive things are also complemented by the fact that the dwarves are known to be greedy, and they hoard money and silver and gold, and they don't ever seem to want to help their neighbors. They're very isolationist, they're very insular. There's a positive and a negative, perhaps, to the depiction of the dwarves. And when Tolkien explicitly said that for him the dwarves represented in some way were inspired by the Jews, it's hard not to see that as kind of a double-bladed, double-edged sword, because there are elements of that which are very relevant to the negative aspects of Jews in folklore, which obviously Tolkien, like Rowling, is very well aware of, but he also perhaps tries to put a more positive spin on it. But both authors, no matter how hard they try, are unable to escape from the long history of depiction of Jews in very anti-Semitic ways. And again, there's certain key aspects: greed, association with money, association with being separate from people and not wanting to be generous or kind to people around them, and being very other in many ways. That othering of them, both in fantasy, in the Grimm fairy tales and Tolkien and others, or in reality, led to so much of what came to be 20th century anti-Semitism, when it was very easy for people, regular Germans or other people in Europe, to see Jews as other and strange, because so much of the culture that they would have learned as children taught them that Jews are other as strange. Whether we called them Jews or goblins or dwarves or whatever, there was ways in which many of those creatures and many explicit characters were Jew-coded, we might say.
Maybe authors should take more responsibility and fact check as well. It's not fact, it's assumptions, not assume assumptions. And look into things better.
Nowadays, in a lot of fiction writing, it's very common in the last 10 years. There's now whole people whose jobs are to be sensitivity readers. So when someone is publishing a book that has elements of a culture in it, the publisher will often send it to a sensitivity reader who is of that culture or of that background, in order for them to check that there's nothing that offensive in it or nothing that's stereotypical. As far as I am aware, this has never been done with any characterizations of Jews. It's commonly done with other peoples and marginalized identities, whether it's an LGBT character, whether it's something relevant to a particular culture what the author is not. If you, as a British person, write a book about the history of Mexico and set a story in Mexico, then your publisher will probably check it with someone from Mexico to make sure you didn't say anything wrong or offensive. But all of these things, as you say, Sarah, taking responsibility, all of these depictions are never really checked by Jews. There aren't Jewish sensitivity readers. One of the things that perhaps is relevant to the whole debate that's happened in the UK the last few years, exemplified by David Baddiel's book, Jews Don't Count. Right? In so many of these ways, Jews are exempted from this process of being sensitive and careful and attentive to the history of persecution and exploitation. Not to say that there isn't perhaps some improvement, and I have an interesting example to share with you in a little bit, but it's got a long way to go. I thought this really interesting from an article following on in this whole drama about Jon Stewart saying that the Jews were the goblins were anti-Semitic. He said Rowling almost definitely didn't do this intentionally. Rowling also borrowed and pastiche from all sorts of fantasy and folklore while writing Harry Potter, so it's likely that a lot of the goblins' more anti-Semitic features are actually related to older fantasy fare surrounding bankers. It just so happens that those were probably inspired by anti-Jewish propaganda. Of course, the intention hardly matters. The fact of the matter is that the Gringotts goblins are absolutely coded as anti-Semitic Jewish stereotypes, propelling an image that has been and continues to be used against Jewish people by supporters of racist and nationalist ideologies. It's quite an interesting question about intention in these stories, not just in Harry Potter, not just in Tolkien, but in even the stories of the Brothers Grimm. How much do they intend for those stories to be anti-Semitic versus how much was it just something that was so much part of their cultural milieu that they didn't even question it? And critically here, the author points out something very important, which is that it is inadvertent because it is so deep in European sensibilities that the image of a greedy, money-hungry, insensitive, unkind character is often a way of coding and thinking about Jews. Now, the reason is because Jews served, as you may know, largely in professions related to money lending and finance for largely the medieval period in Europe. That's because they were prohibited from many other professions as an active way to make sure that Jewish people kind of remained in minority. And it was only after the First Crusade, when many European kingdoms started to go bankrupt, that they started permitting anyone to lend money. The financial system really only began in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. And when the financial system as we know it now, credit, debit, international lending and finance, all of it was something which was abhorrent to the church, despite their own long history of greed and collecting money and resources. And all of it was something that was abhorrent to many wealthy Christian aristocrats. And so instead it became common to give Jews, because they had no other occupations, the jobs of money lending, tax collection, rent collection, and other financial related professions. And it makes a certain kind of sense. You can almost think that if you're the average farmer in 1364 in Bavaria, and every couple months someone shows up to collect taxes from you that go to the wealthy aristocrat, the nobility that lives nearby, who you are a feudal subject of, and that person is always a Jewish person, because it's the only job they can do, then this very negative interaction which you have with someone, in which they're doing something quite exploitative, starts to be about the person themselves, the Jewish person. And it's a very convenient strategy on the part of the nobility to always make Jews their middlemen in doing these transactions, because of course people are going to hate the tax collector and the rent collector and the money lender. And it often becomes the case that as these professions grow, these stories start to grow as well. And the stereotype comes from the reality that Jews were forced into these professions not by choice, but because there was nothing else available to them. When they became too good at them, right, they were taken away. Famously, there was a Jew in England named Aaron of Lincoln, who was the most successful businessman of the 11th century, who became too successful, was a threat to the crown. They had all of his assets taken away. And it was part of what motivated the king, Richard III, I believe, to ban the Jews from England in 1290. They didn't return, we didn't return, until Oliver Cromwell at the very beginning of the 18th century, the end of the 17th century. 500 years, supposedly, there were no Jews in England. There were some, but no official communities, purely because the Jews were too successful at the job they were forced to do, and thus became a threat. So this threat from the idea of the Jewish moneylender is there in so many of the stories we tell. In the stories we read today in Harry Potter, in the stories we read to children sometimes in Rumpelstiltskin, and in many of the stories that make up the backbone of European folklore, which is really exemplified by those collected by the Brothers Grimm, which I've got a few more to talk about. So many of us don't read these ones, but these are all direct stories from the Brothers Grimm's collections. Someone want to read this one for us? One of you guys feel like reading?
Okay, I'll do it.
Thank you, Janice.
In the year 1462, in the village of Rim in Troil, a number of Jews convinced a poor farmer to surrender his small child to them in return for a large sum of money. They took the child out into the woods, where on the large stone they martyred it to death in the most unspeakable manner. From that time, the stone has been called the Jew's stone. Afterward, they hung the mutilated body on a birch tree not far from the bridge. That's the sort of thing they talk about with Jews' blood and matzahs and...
Absolutely, right? The blood libel, we call it.
Yeah. The children's mother was working in a field when the murder took place. She suddenly thought of her child, and without knowing why, she was overcome with fear. Meanwhile, 3 drops of fresh blood fell onto her hand, one after the other. Filled with terror, She rushed home and asked for her child. Her husband brought her inside and confessed what he had done. He was about to show her the money that would free them from the property, but it had turned into leaves. Then the father became mad and died from sorrow, but the mother went out and sought her child. She found it hanging from the tree, and with hot tears took it down and carried it to the church at Rym. It is lying there to this day, and the people look on it as a holy child. They also brought the Jews' stone there. According to the legend, a shepherd cut down the birch tree from which the child had hung, but when he attempted to carry it home, it broke his leg and he died from the injury. That's horrible.
Horrible, horrible story. All right, we have a greatest hits here of the worst anti-Semitic tropes. Again, this is another of the Brothers Grimm collections. This is not the usual story collection. It's called Deutsche Sagen, right? German history, basically, is what they attempted to collect. This is 1816, not too far from our own time, right? Only 200 years ago. And they're telling a story that they heard in collecting folk tales about something that happened in 1462.
A Jew wouldn't have killed a child. It's just not.
Of course not.
They would do.
No, of course not. But let's look at the tropes that are here, right? So the Jews, a number of them, because they act as a group, of course, convinced a poor farmer, who we feel sympathetic for, to sell their child for him in exchange for money, right? So the Jews not only have no morality, but they exemplify their lack of morality by buying things. They use their money in order to get power. So they use their money to buy this child, who they then murdered in a most unspeakable way. And the result, of course, is the money wasn't even real money, right? The deception goes so many levels, because when the farmer, who, terrified at having sold his child to be killed, went to show his wife, well, at least we've got some money, the money turned into leaves. Right? So we have not only magic and deception and murder and blood, we have lots of things here that go, of course, all the way back to very early Christian stories. Certainly the New Testament of, murdered people and dripping blood and guilt and everything that goes with that, and sacrifice. But we also see a real description. The Brothers Grimm were just anthropologists, right? They were just collecting what they heard. And we see a real description of a common practice that in 1816 or thereabouts, 400 nearly years after this took place, right? The people still had in their local church the body of this child and had it as a holy relic. And they also had the stone that he was killed on. And everyone who went to church in this town in Tyrol in Austria saw and knew this story about how the Jews once killed this child. And here's the stone that they killed the child on. And here's the body of the child. And by the way, even the guy who tried to cut down the tree, even the tree was so cursed by the Jews' perfidy that when he tried to carry it, the tree crushed his leg and he died. Pretty grim, pun intended. Right? You can imagine if you grew up hearing these stories, it'd be really hard to convince you that Jews are not horrible, evil, subhuman monsters. That's the power of stories. Right? The stories we tell influence us in great, great deal of ways, because they tell us who the heroes are and who the villains are. Just as comic books do and the stories we tell today, right? The hero and the villain is something that you carry with you from childhood. And it's very clear who the villain is in stories like these. It's not the only one. It's not exceptional, right?
It all originates from the ignorance of money, why Jews collected money.
It does.
Propagated everything else.
Yeah, it does. It is very, so it's related to money, and it's related very deeply to Christianity. You can see this is a almost contemporaneous illustrated manuscript, 15th century, right, from a similar region, depicting Jews as money lenders. You can see the way in which the noses are depicted on the two Jewish men, right, who are wearing the pointy red hats. This was a hat they were required to wear to identify them as Jews. It was called the Jew's cap for a long time because it was a way in which Jews were identified. We, of course, know about the yellow star during Nazi Germany, but that was only one of a long list of ways in which Christian governments in Europe forced Jews to be publicly identifiable. Because, of course, the scariest thing about the Jews to many of these people were that you couldn't tell who they are. right? It leads this very conspiratorial air. They look just like us. They're living amongst us. You can't spot them. And so the way of forcing them to be identifiable became very common, right, in many, many places. But this illustration tells us a lot, even without words, right? The clever trickstery smiles, the bags of money, the Jews counting the money and taking, it seems, a very large pile of money away from this, earnest, well-intentioned, dour-looking farmer, perhaps we can imagine. They're doing it behind closed doors. It's all very secretive and all very negative. Jews and money and blood are very, very closely related in all of these stories. There are no exceptions. There are no positive depictions. Right, we have another PowerPoint. It's not working. Another upsetting story. Here's another bit of lovely art for you. Right, this is following the Black Plague in the 14th century, because Jews were blamed for causing the Black Plague. There were very energetic mass burnings of Jewish people, and it wasn't clearly something that the communities were ashamed of, because they often depicted them in artwork, in stained glass windows, and in illustrated manuscripts. This is one that's been colorized here, but originally, of course, was in a manuscript depicting the Jews being burnt in a mass fire after the Black Plague, as they were guilty. You can see again the pointy red caps that some of them are wearing. Men, women, and children depicted in here. Quite a horrifying image, considering 500 years later, this sort of imagery was, of course, repeated in the Holocaust. And it's not something that was hidden by the Christian authorities. It was something that was celebrated, which is the troubling part, perhaps, more than anything else. Another little story from the Grimms, last one, I promise. And then a modern story for us. Nick or Sarah, do you want to read for us? Sorry, it's not very exciting reading material. You're on mute, I'm afraid, Nick. There you go.
Okay. So, in the year 1267, in time, an old woman, driven by greed, sold an innocent 7-year-old girl to the Jews. The Jews gagged her to keep her from crying out, cut open her veins, and surrounded her in order to catch her blood with cloths. The child soon died from the torture, and they weighed her down with stones and threw her into the Ents River. A few days later, little Margaret searched for her little hand above the screaming water. A number of people, including the Margrave himself, soon assembled. Some boatmen succeeded in pulling the child out of the water. She was still alive, but as soon as she had called for vengeance against her murderers, she died. Suspicion fell upon the Jews, and they were all summoned to appear. As they approached the corpse, blood began to stream from its open wound. The Jews and the old woman confessed the evil deed and were executed. The child's coffin, with an inscription, stands next to the bell rope near the entrance to the palace church at Pforzheim. Children of the members of the Boatmen's Guild unanimously passed the legend from generation to generation that at that time the Margrave rewarded their ancestors by freeing them from sentry duty in the city of Pforzheim, as long as the sun and the moon continued to shine. At the same time, they were given the right to be represented by 24 boatmen, carrying arms and musical instruments, who parade and stand and watch over the city every year in the carnival celebration. This privilege applies even to this day. Okay.
Thank you, Nick. So what do we see that's familiar and different about this story, again, from the collection Deutsche Sagen?
Got the blood and the dead girl, where she survives and then tells the tale. And then
she survives just long enough to call out for vengeance, it seems.
And the fact they celebrate it every year, or at the carnival.
Yeah, so what exactly is happening here? It's the boatmen, right? This is the Boatmen's Guild, who the story comes from. And so there's a guild, a professional guild of people who run riverboats. And this is their origin story for how it is that they were given privileges by the local aristocracy, the Margrave of the region. That's like a count or such, right? is they were given this privilege of not having to serve sentry duty. This is like in St. Albans Cathedral when everyone had to serve on sentry duty over Albans Shrine once a year for a night, right? They were given an exemption from this because this one time in 1267 they found the murderers of this little girl named Margaret, and as a result they've been given this privilege ever since. 600 years later, they're still telling the story about how once those horrible Jews killed a little girl and we found them and put them to death. And again, we see that the child's coffin with an inscription explaining the story still stands in the church at Forsheim. You can still go, and presumably all the people who live there still heard this story, and the Boatmen's Guild continued to pass on this story. We see the same trope of a wicked but themselves not Jewish person selling children to the Jews. The Jews, of course, then killing them. This is, as we mentioned, the blood libel in many ways, right? A tradition that actually begins in all places, in Norwich, as far as we can tell. The first story of blood libel was in the 12th century in Norwich, here in England, describing a story in which Jews supposedly murdered a little boy in order to take his blood. What the Jews do with the blood varies depending on the story. Sometimes they're making matzah, which is absurd, of course. Sometimes they're using it for all sorts of evil, magical, dark rituals. Sometimes they just seem to like killing Christian children. The story goes viral in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century, and continues to be repeated today in many iterations. And it all starts from this same point of view of trying to vilify the Jews as other, as evil, as greedy, as murderous. And it is so consistent. This is from a totally different place, right? This is from, I believe this is in Bavaria, right, in the south of Germany, in the plains. The other story was from Austria in the Alps mountains. Two totally different cultural regions. The only thing they have in common seems to be they both have very similar stories about this blood libel image. And they're not the only one. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of cities which have these same stories and these same depictions, including Norwich Cathedral, right? Which until recently, I believe, had the bones of the little boy that supposedly was killed by the Jews in the cathedral with a plaque that explains it.
Is it the church perpetuating these stories?
Well, we have to ask ourselves, I think, how these things come about. We've seen, of course, the modern incarnation of these things like perhaps the goblins, things like Tolkien and others. But where they come from is really hard to tell. And what we do in response to them is really hard to know. Many of them seem to come from the influence of the church. There's no doubt that Christianity plays a big role. You might even say that it's impossible to imagine anti-Semitism without Christianity, to some extent. Anti-Semitism as we know it. Because all of these stories, in some way, although they're rarely cognizant of it, are referencing the ideas of the New Testament, and particularly the Church Fathers, that the Jews, which of course is a false idea considering Jesus was a rabbi, were responsible for Jesus' death, and in particular the character of Judas, right? Judas, whose name is Yehuda, meaning the same as we call ourselves, the Yehudim, after Judah, the one in the book of Genesis, not the one who was Jesus' friend, right? What do we know about Judas Iscariot? Judas Iscariot. He betrays his friend for money. He collects his blood. He's stained by that. And money and blood and murder all go hand in hand in that first story of a Jewish stereotype around this, which of course is the most repeated story in the world, the best-selling book of all time. So it's very hard to escape in some way the fact that these things are a result of a certain kind of thinking within Christianity. They're also the result of that Christian thinking combined with the reality of Jewish life in medieval Europe, and the fact that Jews were working in these professions that fed into the stories, and that people already had such negative views of non-Christians in these societies. Jews were often the only religious minority at the time. There weren't Muslim populations living in Europe at the time. There weren't really religious minorities at the time. Up until the Protestant Reformation, there was only really one church and one group of people. When there were religious minorities, they were persecuted. Not just the Jews, but even Christian religious minorities, many of which as a result fled to other places. So the Jews were very unavoidably other. They didn't fit in. They didn't look like everyone else. They didn't dress like everyone else because they were forced not to. They didn't work in the jobs everyone else did because they were forced not to. They didn't partake in the rituals and the society that everyone else did. And that fed into this stereotype that I think came all the way from Christian sources. And just like a snowball, the more it went on, the worse it got, and the bigger and bigger and bigger this myth got of the Jews being the enemy of good European people. And it is not difficult, of course, when you look at this long history, right? Certainly 1,000 years, but arguably more, to see how we get to the rhetoric of the Holocaust and the rhetoric of Goebbels and the rhetoric of so many of the films and media that were produced in the early 20th century, because it was a very easy sell. All the Nazis were basically saying was the same thing that other people have been saying for a very long time, the same thing that children grew up learning in storybooks and that people saw when they went to church in their local village. Right, which is the Jews were a parasite, the Jews were murderous, the Jews were out for money and blood and control. And it doesn't serve us or history very well to think of the Nazis and their ideology as something which exists in a vacuum, right, which is an exception. It's not an exception, it's actually a culmination of a long process of this same trope growing and developing. And even if we take it outside of the horrible consequences of Nazi rule in Europe, even if we take it to something as mundane as fantasy fiction today, there are ways in which this still shows up. And it's harder to identify because it's less obvious and it's less intentional. I don't think that the goblins are anti-Semitic in the way that the Grimm stories are, because I don't think that J.K. Rowling intended them to be. But it is hard to avoid the fact that much of the way in which we code evil villains in modern stories, drawing on this European folklore, is often very similar or explicitly the same as a lot of the anti-Semitism that we see. Now, what do we do about it? How do we respond to it? That's what's interesting, I think, to me in many ways. What do you think?
The blood bit is so foreign from Jewish culture that if you explain to people that you try to get rid of any blood, it can't possibly be true.
Oh, it's not true. There's no doubt whatsoever that it's not true. It doesn't fit an understanding of Judaism at all, as you say, considering the obsessive way in which the Torah tells us to never eat blood.
The other thing is, so many people in the UK have never met a Jew. I've experienced that somebody thought we should have horns, and they generally thought this when we were working in Hampshire.
Yeah.
There was no concept at all. So they hear these stories, people still believe things.
Yeah, the people do. Even well-educated people. It's not just rural country bumpkins, right? We have, even at Sam's, had issues in which, notable people of our local society, including sometimes MPs, have made comments about how much Jews love money, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is a difficult thing to square with the fact that this is not a one-off comment. Clearly, whether cognizant, and I'm sure it's not intentional, and I'm sure it's not cognizant, and I'm sure it's not an effort to offend, people are tapping into these stereotypes because they are everywhere. They're obvious and everywhere. And that makes it very hard to counter.
So, can I ask, Adam, I know you do many school visits that you host. Do you get sort of strange questions from you about what Jews are really like? I mean, do they look at you and say, why haven't you got a horns and tail?
I've never gotten the horns and tail one, but I do think that school visits are a really, really important thing that I do. Maybe the most important thing that I do, because as exactly as you said, Janice, a lot of people don't know any Jewish people. They don't know much about Judaism. And we can't do anything to stop this fact that actually the European tradition, history, culture, religion has this so deeply embedded. The only thing we do is perhaps try and provide a counter narrative, which involves showing that this isn't the case. So, I mean, a large part of what I try to do in school visits is just show kids that, Jewish people are largely normal. I mean, I'm not sure I'm normal in any way, but I appear to be. And, it gives them the sense that if I go to a school, and I go to a lot of schools, and I spend an hour talking to them about Judaism, and they go, oh, that's interesting. It's a little bit different than what we do, but actually seems like largely the same. Then maybe in 10 years' time, when they grow up and they hear someone say something anti-Semitic, they'll stop. Maybe they'll stop just for a second and go, I don't know, met a rabbi once, he seemed all right. Right? I mean, it's a small chance, but it's enough of a chance that makes it worthwhile, that simply actually retelling the story, telling a counter story, is often the best thing we can do.
My son-in-law
sorry.
goes into schools and he gives them this experience and takes them food and stuff and makes them have a good experience rather than making it dry, and that's worked quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so many kids are really excited about learning about the Torah and hearing the shofar. Shofar is always a hit, right? And, they might not learn anything about Judaism from that, but they have a positive sense that actually Jews are not so foreign or so strange, right? Don't look so different, don't speak so differently, except for my weird accent. There's a sense in which actually it just goes to show that Jews are not that other from them, which is hugely helpful.
Just as Israel hasn't sold itself well to the outside world, Jews haven't either.
Sorry, Sarah, it's hard to hear you. There's a funny sound.
Sorry. Just as Israel has never sold itself very well, Jews haven't over the centuries sold themselves well.
Yes, I know. I see what you mean. There's a question of how much we're responsible for trying to counter these horrible narratives about us, how much we have to be the ones to go out and say otherwise. We would love it if people would simply realize that they're wrong, but sometimes we do have to sell ourselves, as you say, kind of go out and actually explain and make an effort to try and show that things aren't what people think. One thing that I think is really interesting for Jewish people is a way of telling the story differently. One of the best books, fiction books I've read in the last few years, and this is what I wanted to end on, is a book called Spinning Silver. Anybody read Spinning Silver? It's I guess it's a historical fantasy book. It's basically a very clever retelling of the Rumpelstiltskin story by a woman named Naomi Novik, who's a very good novelist. And the story follows a character named Miriam, who lives in kind of anonymous, somewhere Central Europe, in anonymous kind of 17th, 18th century, perhaps, and deals a lot with these tropes. And I just wanted to read you the very beginning of the book from chapter 1, because I think it's really an interesting way to end. The real story isn't half as pretty as the one you've heard. The real story is, the miller's daughter with her long golden hair wants to catch a lord, a prince, a rich man's son. So she goes to the moneylender and borrows for a ring and a necklace and decks herself out for the festival. And she's beautiful enough, so the lord, the prince, the rich man's son notices her and dances with her and tumbles her in a quiet hayloft when the dancing is over. And afterwards he goes home and marries the rich woman his family's picked out for him. Then the miller's despoiled daughter tells everyone that the moneylender's in league with the devil, and the village runs him out or maybe even stones him. So at least she gets to keep the jewels for a dowry, and the blacksmith marries her before that firstborn child comes along a little early. Because that's what the story's really about, getting out of paying your debts. That's not how they tell it. But I knew. My father was a moneylender, you see. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating story. It's a good story, because it really takes some of these tropes and flips them on their head, right? It's a way of thinking about the role of Jews and money lending, and gives you a window into the other point of view, which, as the narrator explains, is all of these people and their foibles, their desire for having pretty things, their desire to not pay their debts, the desire to blame their problems on someone else, always got located on the Jews. And she writes that the author actually isn't Jewish, which is surprising, but she writes it from a really genuine point of view. In some way, it's a way, I think, of retelling the stories. It is a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, an interesting way of changing the story. And I think that the power of fairy tales is that they can be retold in different ways. And perhaps in addition to re-education and, better explanations on our part and on behalf of our allies, people who aren't Jewish, who support the right way of thinking about this, in some way, the best thing we can do is take these stories, the Brothers Grimm stories we looked at, the Jew in the Thorns, the Rumpelstiltskin, all of these horrible stories about children being hurt, and turn them on their heads in some way, retell them, rechange, and rethink about the stories that we tell and what they mean to us. I really encourage you to read Spinning Silver, if it's something that interests you, because it really made me think a lot about this and how it is that we deal with this omnipresent idea that although many people in civilized world would say they don't believe, they unconsciously often subscribe to in ways they aren't even aware of. And it's really important for the next century as much as it has been for the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 centuries that have come before us. Thank you for joining me this evening. Lovely to see you guys online with us, and thank you if anyone's listening later online on YouTube as well. Please join us next time. I think we'll have a slightly cheerier topic, but I don't recall.
Thank you. It was